The evidence is undeniable. My client, my father, is innocent.
She never said a word the night he found her. 15 years later, she stood in a courtroom and used words like a scalpel to cut every man who tried to destroy her father wide open. Before we dive in, if you believe loyalty should mean something, that family isn't always blood, and that betrayal deserves to be exposed in broad daylight, hit subscribe and drop a like right now. Only the traitors, the backstabbers, and the Yunte Six of the world skip this part. Everyone else, let's go. The rain over Seoul that Tuesday night wasn't the gentle, cinematic kind. It was the kind that made umbrellas obsolete out of spite, the kind that turned Myeongdong's neon into smeared watercolor and sent every rational person sprinting for shelter, which was exactly why nobody expected Kang Min-jae's convoy, three black SUVs gliding through the city like a funeral procession nobody had died for yet, to stop. "Sir, we have 6 minutes before the Busan shipment window closes," his driver said, already regretting the sentence as it left his mouth. You didn't remind Kang Min-jae about schedules. Schedules answered to him, not the other way around. But Min-jae wasn't listening. He was watching a shape behind the restaurant dumpster on Yuljiro 3 Small, folded into itself. A foot bare and blue-tinged, poking out from under a cardboard flap that was doing absolutely nothing against the downpour. Every bodyguard in that convoy had a gun. None of them had a plan for this. He got out. "Sir," someone started. The door shut on the word. Understands something about Kang Min-jae. Men who crossed him disappeared from ledgers, from guest lists, from the city itself, and nobody ever asked follow-up questions, because follow-up questions were how you ended up in your own missing person report. He was not a sentimental man. Sentiment was a liability with no resale value, and he'd built an empire specifically by not carrying any liabilities he couldn't write off. And yet here he was, a man worth more than a small province, lowering himself into a filthy puddle in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, close enough to see the child flinch away from him like he was one more thing in a long line of things that had hurt her. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. It wasn't gentle. Min-jae didn't know how to do gentle. It wasn't in his vocabulary, the way certain languages have no word for a concept the culture never needed. But it was quiet, and it was the first question anyone had asked her in 3 days. That wasn't "Where's your mother?" or "Get out of here," or nothing at all. She shook her head. Just once. Small. Something in Min-jae's chest, a door he had bricked shut so long ago he'd forgotten it used to open, cracked down the middle. He took off his jacket, $2,000 of Italian wool instantly ruined, and wrapped it around a girl who weighed less than his briefcase. He did not consult his lawyers. He did not run a background check. For the first time in 20 years, Kang Min-jae made a decision that had nothing to do with leverage. "What's your name?" he asked, lifting her like she was made of glass and grudges. She didn't answer. Later, he'd learned she hadn't spoken in weeks, not since the group home, not since the last set of hands that were supposed to protect her decided otherwise. So he gave her one instead. Hana. First. Because whatever came before this moment didn't count anymore. This was where her story actually started. His bodyguard stood frozen in the rain, watching the most dangerous man in Seoul carry a homeless child to his car with the exact same care he'd once used to carry a bomb out of a rival's warehouse. Like the smallest wrong move would cost him everything. They had no idea that night how right that instinct would turn out to be. 15 years later, it wouldn't be a bomb that threatened to end Kang Min-jae. It would be a courtroom, a folder of forged signatures, and a man who had smiled at his dinner table for 2 decades while quietly sharpening a knife behind his back. But that was 15 years away. That night, there was only a girl in a ruined jacket, a driver who never mentioned the missed shipment window again. Seoul kept its rain. Min-jae kept the girl. Neither of them knew yet that he'd need her far more than she'd ever needed him. 3 months into having a daughter, Kang Min-jae discovered something no rival gang, no corrupt prosecutor, and no rival cartel had ever managed to do to him. He lost an argument. "I don't want the pink one," Hana said, arms crossed, staring down a wall of school backpacks like they'd personally wronged her. She'd been talking for 6 weeks now, slowly, carefully, like she was still deciding whether words were safe to spend. But when she did talk, she talked like someone who'd inherited her father's negotiating instincts and none of his patience for losing. "The pink one is on sale," Min-jae said, in the same flat, immovable tone he used to inform Min that their warehouse now belonged to someone else. I don't care. Behind him, two bodyguards pretended very hard to be interested in the store's fire extinguisher because the alternative was watching their boss, a man who had once ended a three-family turf war with one phone call, get out negotiated by a 6-year-old in a Hello Kitty aisle. He bought the black one. Of course he did. That was the shape their life took in the years that followed. A strange, lopsided archive of contradictions that Min Jae's enemies would have paid enormous sums to see and would have found completely useless because none of it looked like weakness. It looked like something else, something they didn't have a name for. There were report cards, which Min Jae read with the same intensity he applied to shipping manifests, red pen in hand, circling anything below a 95 like it was a discrepancy in a ledger. There were recitals, where he sat in the third row in a suit that made every other parent in the auditorium quietly recalculate their life choices, clapping exactly on beat, exactly twice as hard as necessary, because subtlety had never been his strongest asset. There was the incident in the 6th grade, never fully explained to Hana, though she pieced it together years later, when a boy named Ji-hoon had shoved her into a locker, and by the following Monday, Ji-hoon's father had lost his restaurant lease, his parking permit, and, mysteriously, his gym membership. Min Jae never raised his voice about it. He didn't need to. He simply made problems disappear the way weather makes things disappear, quietly, completely, and with no explanation owed to anyone. You didn't have to do that, Hana told him once, at 14, having finally worked out the timeline. Do what? Min Jae said, not looking up from his newspaper. She let it go. That was their language. Things understood, never confirmed, filed away like evidence neither of them would ever need to produce in court. But there was a second life running underneath the first one, and Hana was old enough now to notice its outline even if she couldn't see its shape. Men came to the house late at night and left without saying goodbye. Phone calls ended the second she walked into a room, and there was Yoon Tae-sik. Uncle Tae-sik, she'd called him since she was small, the man who'd stood beside her father since before she existed, who brought her books from Tokyo business trips and remembered her birthday down to the specific brand of cake she liked. She loved him, in the uncomplicated way children love the fixtures of their childhood. She had no way of knowing that Uncle T-Sick had started keeping a second set of books that year, not for the company, but for himself. A quiet ledger of every deal he'd closed that Min Jae got credit for. Every year he'd stayed the loyal second while somebody else's name went on the building. Resentment, like rust, doesn't announce itself. It just waits in the places nobody's checking. By the time Hana left for law school, Min Jae had converted 80% of his holdings into legitimate businesses. Real estate, logistics, a security firm that had, against all odds, actually started providing security instead of extorting it. He told himself this was for her, that she'd never have to explain her father's name at a dinner party, never have to watch someone's face change when they made the connection. He didn't know, not yet, that going clean doesn't erase the fingerprints already on file. It just makes them easier to plant. The night before she left for Seoul National University, Hana found him on the balcony, staring at the skyline like it owed him money. You're doing that thing, she said, where you look like you're about to declare war on a cloud. I'm thinking? About what? He didn't answer for a long moment. About how the people closest to you are the only ones with a key to the house. She didn't understand what he meant. Not then. It would take another 8 years, a raided office, and a signature that wasn't his but looked close enough to fool everyone. Everyone except her. Before those words would come back to her like a verdict already written, just waiting for the evidence to catch up. The morning it all came apart started, appropriately enough, with a headline that hadn't been true yet. Hana was 29, 3 years into a legal career that had already made her a minor legend in Seoul's courtrooms. The associate who read contracts the way arson investigators read fire damage, tracing every clause back to its point of origin. She was in a deposition when her phone buzzed for the 4th time in 10 minutes, which was how she knew, before she even looked, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Turn on the news. Now. From Min Jae's assistant, a woman who did not use exclamation points recreationally, she excused herself, walked into the hallway, and watched her father's face fill a television screen mounted above a coffee machine. Underneath a red banner that read Empire under investigation, like it was a diagnosis instead of an accusation. By the time she got a car to his headquarters, the building already had that specific, wrong stillness of a hive that's been smoked out. Investigators and windbreakers carried boxes through the lobby like they were doing inventory at an estate sale for a man who wasn't dead yet. 6 companies raided simultaneously, a level of coordination that took planning, resources, and, most tellingly, advanced knowledge of exactly where to look. They knew where every account was, Min-jae said when she finally found him in his office, the one-room investigators hadn't yet cleared out, sitting very still behind a desk that suddenly looked too large for him. Not where they might be, where they were. Which means someone told them. Which means someone who's been inside long enough to know. Neither of them said the name. Some sentences you don't finish out loud because finishing them makes them real, and there are certain kinds of real you'd rather keep circling forever. The evidence, when Hana finally got access to it, made her stomach drop in a way 12 years of legal training hadn't prepared her for. It wasn't messy. It wasn't the usual scattershot financial chaos she was used to picking apart. It was clean. Too clean. A paper trail laid out in a straight, obedient line. Every signature, every transfer, every date arranged like someone had built a maze with exactly one path through it, and that path led directly to her father. "This isn't evidence," she said, flipping through it at 2 a.m. in her father's kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd once threatened to bully's father with nothing but a stare. "This is a script." Min-jae didn't answer. He was staring at a folder with Yoon T6 initials on the intake sheet. Standard procedure. The kind of paperwork that meant nothing, except that T6 had personally overseen the internal audits 6 months earlier. The audit that, in hindsight, looked less like due diligence and more like a man taking inventory of exactly which doors to leave unlocked. Here's a question worth sitting with. How do you fight an enemy who spent 20 years learning exactly where you keep your heart unguarded? Drop your answer below, because in a few chapters, you're going to want to have already picked a side. By the following week, Deputy Director Song, a mid-level prosecutor with an expensive watch and an inexplicably fast timeline for a man handling his first major case, had frozen every account Min-jae's companies touched. Executives were arrested on live television, hands cuffed behind their backs while reporters shouted questions they already had scripted answers for. The story wasn't being investigated. It was being performed, and performed well, which told Hana more than any single piece of evidence could. Someone had spent a long time writing this. "I want you to stay out of it," Min-jae told her, the night before his first hearing, in a voice she'd heard him use exactly twice before. Once when a rival threatened to come after their family directly, and once, years ago, at a hospital, when a doctor used the word malignant. "No. Hana, you knelt in the rain for a kid who couldn't say thank you," she said. "You think I'm going to sit in an office building filing motions for somebody else's father while they burn down what's left of you?" He looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of a man recalculating, for the first time in 15 years, who exactly had been protecting whom. "They're going to come after you too," he said, "the second you walk into that courtroom." "Good," Hannah said, already pulling out her laptop. "Let them." Outside, Seoul kept doing what Seoul does, indifferent, glittering, entirely unbothered by the fact that somewhere inside it, a war that had been building for 20 years was about to reach its opening argument. The courtroom on the morning of the first hearing had the particular electricity of a room that already thought it knew the ending. Reporters lined the back wall 3 deep, cameras angled toward the defendant's table like hunters who'd already field-dressed the animal and were just waiting for the paperwork. Deputy Director Song sat at the prosecution's table, adjusting his cufflinks with the unhurried calm of a man who'd rehearsed this morning in a mirror. And Kang Min-jae, the weathermaker, the man who once turned a room's temperature just by entering it, sat alone at the defense table like a furnace with the pilot light blown out. Hana wasn't allowed to represent him. Conflict of interest, the family kind. The kind courts frown on precisely because it works too well. So she sat 2 rows back, in the gallery, watching a team of competent, expensive lawyers get quietly dismantled by evidence that had clearly been assembled by someone who knew exactly which threads to pull. The first witness was a former accountant named Park, who spoke in the flat, over-rehearsed cadence of a man reading from a script he'd memorized under duress, or under payment. Though those two things, Hana had learned, often wore the same face in court. He testified to shell accounts, to signatures, to a paper trail with Min-jae's name stamped on every page like a brand on cattle. "And you're certain," the prosecutor said, That Mr. Kang personally authorized these transfers? Yes. One word. No hesitation. The kind of certainty that either comes from truth or from a very good price. Hana watched her father's face throughout. Perfectly still, the same stillness he'd worn the night he found her in the rain. The stillness of a man who trained himself, over decades, not to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him break. But she'd grown up reading that face like scripture. She knew where the cracks were, even when nobody else could see them. And what she saw, watching him listen to a story built entirely out of half-truths and full lies, wasn't fear. It was recognition. He knew whose fingerprints were on this. He just didn't have proof yet. And in a courtroom, knowing isn't currency. Proof is. By the lunch recess, the financial channels had already started running commentary pieces with titles like The End of an Empire in 25 Years, Gone in a Morning. The kind of headlines written by people who'd clearly finished their articles before the trial had finished its first witness. Min Jae's own legal team, in the hallway outside, was having the particular hushed conversation that lawyers have when they've stopped trying to win and started trying to lose gracefully. "We should discuss a plea," one of them murmured to Min Jae, not quite meeting his eyes. Given the volume of the evidence. "No, sir, respectfully, the accounts alone." "No." Hannah, standing a few feet away, felt something cold and clear settle into place in her chest. The specific, focused calm she got right before she won a case. The same calm her father used to mistake for coincidence until he learned to recognize it as a warning sign for whoever was about to lose. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her father's kitchen table. Table, the same chair she'd done homework in at 8 years old, while he circled red pen marks over her math. And she went through every document in the case file for the fourth time, not looking for what was there, but for what had been left out. Because a story that clean, that convenient, always has a seam somewhere. Somebody always leaves a thread hanging, thinking nobody will bother pulling it. She found it at 3:47 in the morning. A wire transfer, buried 3 shell companies deep, routed through an account that had absolutely nothing to do with her father's businesses. An account that, when she traced its registration, belonged to a mid-level prosecutor with an expensive watch and a suspiciously fast-tracked case. Deputy Director Song. Her hands went still over the keyboard. If Song was dirty, that meant the impartial investigation had been anything but. And if someone had paid him to build this case, someone with the access, the motive, and 20 years of proximity to know exactly which doors to leave unlocked, then there was only one name left standing at the center of the maze. She thought of the books Uncle T-Sick used to bring her from Tokyo, the birthday cakes. The man who'd sat at their table for 2 decades, smiling, while apparently keeping a private ledger of every year he hadn't been the one whose name was on the building. "You didn't have to do that," she'd told her father once, about the boy who shoved her into a locker. "Do what?" he'd said. She understood now, sitting alone at 4 a.m. with a folder that was about to blow up 2 men's lives, exactly what he'd meant on that balcony all those years ago. About the people closest to you being the only ones with a key to the house. Someone had used their key, and Hana intended to make very sure it was the last thing they ever unlocked. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from lack of certainty. And by the time Hana walked into Yoon T6's office 3 days later, she'd run out of both. "You look terrible," T6 said, not unkindly, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His office overlooked the Han River, a corner suite he'd earned on paper through 2 decades of loyal service. On paper, everything about Yoon T6 looked exactly like what he'd spent 20 years performing. The devoted second. The man who'd never once asked for more than his share. "You should be resting. Preparing." "I am preparing," Hana said, sitting. "That's why I'm here." "For your father's case?" He folded his hands. "Anything I can do?" "You know that." She studied him. Really studied him. The way she hadn't let herself do since she was small, and love made her lazy about looking too closely at the people who gave her books from Tokyo. There was nothing visibly wrong with him. That was the horror of it. 20 years of practice will smooth even betrayal into something that looks exactly like affection. "I found the wire transfer," she said. The one routed through 3 shells before it landed in Deputy Director Song's personal account. Something in Taesik's face didn't move, which was, itself, a kind of movement. the particular stillness of a man recalculating in real time. That's concerning, he said. You think someone inside is... I think someone spent 5 years building an off-ramp, Hannah said. And I think they got tired of standing next to the throne instead of sitting on it. The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it. The silence of two people who both know exactly what's being said and are both choosing, for one more breath, to let it remain unsaid. Hannah. His voice had changed, softer, almost wounded, the tone of a man appealing to history instead of evidence. I have known you since you were 5 years old. I taught you to ride a bike in that man's driveway. Do you really think? I think, Hannah said, standing, that the people closest to us are the only ones with a key to the house. My father told me that once. I didn't understand it until this week. She left before he could finish whatever sentence he'd started building, a sentence that, she suspected, he'd had a version of ready for years in case this exact moment ever came. If you've ever had someone smile at your table for years while quietly plotting your downfall, you already know there's no version of innocent until proven guilty that applies to people who bring you gifts with one hand and file paperwork against you with the other. Comment below if you've ever spotted a tie sick in your own life before it was too late. Hit subscribe if you believe loyalty should be earned twice, once in the good years and once when it actually costs something. That night, Hannah didn't go home. She went to the one place she knew wouldn't be watched, a small, unremarkable records office in Jongno, where a retired court clerk named Mrs. Bake, a woman her father had quietly helped keep her late husband's restaurant afloat years ago in a kindness so small he'd probably forgotten it, still had access to archived filing systems most lawyers didn't know existed. You're Kang Min-jae's daughter, Mrs. Beck said, not a question, studying her over half-moon glasses. I am. He never asked for anything back, not once in 11 years. She was already pulling a set of dusty registration files from a cabinet. What do you need? What Hannah needed took 6 hours, 4 cups of burnt coffee, and a headache that sat behind her eyes like a fist. But by 5 a.m., she had it. The original incorporation papers for the 3 shell companies filed 18 months ago, not by an anonymous proxy, not by a lawyer with plausible deniability, but by a registered agent whose signature matched, stroke for stroke, a birthday card sitting in a drawer in her father's study. A card that read, in familiar handwriting, to my favorite niece, Uncle Tisik. She sat in Mrs. Bake's cramped, dust-smelling office as the sun came up over Jongno, holding proof of the exact shape of the knife that had been aimed at her father's back for longer than she wanted to calculate. Somewhere across the city, Yoon Tae-sik was almost certainly rehearsing his own testimony, polishing 20 years of performance into one final, seamless act. He didn't know yet that the seams were already showing, that the girl who used to fall off the bike he taught her to ride had spent the night learning exactly how to make sure he never got back up from this one. Hannah closed the folder, and for the first time in 3 days, she smiled. Court, she said quietly, to no one, is going to be interesting. The morning of the final hearing, Kang Min-jae's lawyers had already, quietly, begun preparing him for the worst. We can request leniency, one of them said in the hallway outside the courtroom, straightening papers he clearly no longer believed in. Given your cooperation, given the scale of the businesses affected, a plea now might. No, Min-jae said, for what felt like the 100th time in 2 weeks. He didn't tell them why. He didn't tell them that his daughter had called him at 6 a.m. that morning, voice steady in a way that made his chest tighten with something between terror and pride, and said only, don't say anything today. Just watch. The courtroom filled the way courtrooms do when a verdict feels pre-written. Reporters packed 3 deep, cameras hungry. Deputy Director Song at the prosecution's table, adjusting the same expensive watch, radiating the specific calm of a man who believes the hard part is already behind him. He'd built a case so clean it barely needed a closing argument. He was, Min-jae thought, watching him from the defense table, a man very confident in a maze he believed had only one exit. He had no idea someone had already found the second one. All rise, the judge entered. The room settled into that particular held-breath stillness that precedes an ending everyone in the building thought they already knew. Min-jae sat with his hands folded, still, weathering the last few minutes the way he'd weathered everything for 25 years, by refusing to let his face give anyone the satisfaction. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned. Reporters' pins froze mid-note. Hana walked in wearing black, a single leather briefcase in one hand, her heels striking the floor in a rhythm too, even to belong to anyone nervous. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at her father, not yet. She knew if she did, she might lose the composure she'd spent all night assembling like armor, piece by piece. "I apologize for being late, Your Honor," she said, stopping before the bench. The truth took longer to collect than the lies. A murmur moved through the gallery, the specific sound of a room recalculating in real time. "Counsel," the judge said slowly, "you are not listed as representing the defendant in this matter." "I'm not here to represent him," Hannah said. "I'm here to correct the record." She set the briefcase down and opened it with the unhurried precision of someone who had rehearsed this exact motion in her mind 50 times the night before, until her hands stopped shaking. "The prosecution's case rests on the claim that my father personally authorized transfers through 3 shell accounts. What the prosecution failed to disclose, whether through negligence or design, is who actually incorporated those accounts and where the money went after it left them." Deputy Director Song stood. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "So is filing evidence you personally financed," Hannah said, not raising her voice, "which is what we're about to discuss." The room went very quiet. She placed the first document in front of the judge, the incorporation papers, the registered agent's signature matching a handwriting sample she'd cross-referenced 4 separate ways the night before. "This is the original filing for the first shell account. Notice the signature." She placed a second document beside it, a birthday card, entered as a handwriting exemplar, the ink slightly faded, the words, "To my favorite niece," visible at the top, before the redaction line she'd had to fight the clerk to allow. "This is a sample from the same hand, dated 3 years earlier." A ripple went through the gallery. Reporters who'd arrived that morning to write an obituary were now sitting forward like they'd wandered into a different, far more interesting story. "And this," Hannah said, laying down the third document, "is a wire transfer trail showing the ultimate destination of the funds the prosecution claims my father stole from himself. It ends in a personal account belonging to Deputy Director Song." Song's face had gone the particular color of a man watching his own script get rewritten in real time by someone he'd never bothered to consider a variable. "Your Honor, I object to this entire—" "Sit down, Deputy Director," the judge said, and something in her tone had already shifted, the sound of a room's gravity beginning to reorganize itself around a new center. At the defense table, Kang Min-jae, the man who never let anyone see him break, allowed himself, for just a moment, to close his eyes. Not in relief. Not yet. And something closer to recognition, the specific ache of watching the child you once carried out of the rain grow into the only person capable of carrying you out of the fire. Behind him, in the gallery, someone in a gray suit near the back rose quietly and moved toward the exit, moving a little too fast for a man with nothing to hide. "Bailiff," the judge said without looking up. "Close the doors." Yoon T-6 stopped walking. For a moment, nobody in the courtroom moved. Yoon T-6 stood frozen between the gallery benches and the double doors, one hand still half raised toward the handle, as if physically arguing with the bailiff's words before his body had caught up to the fact that running was no longer an option. "Mr. Yoon," the judge said, "please return to your seat." He did, slowly, and something in the way he walked back, shoulders still trying, out of 2 decades of habit, to hold the posture of the loyal second, told Hannah everything the paperwork hadn't needed to. "Your Honor," Hannah continued, once the room had resettled, "I'd like to enter one final piece of evidence." She placed a fourth document on the bench, a security audit dated 6 months prior, signed and personally overseen by Yoon Tae-sik, the same audit that had, at the time, been presented to the board as routine due diligence. This audit identified the exact accounts, the exact vulnerabilities, and the exact personnel later exploited in this case. It was conducted by the one man with legitimate, unsupervised access to every financial system my father's companies operate, access he used 18 months ago to begin quietly building an alternate paper trail with my father's name on it. She let that sit before she said the rest. Deputy Director Song didn't build this case. He was paid to file it. The architecture, the shell companies, the forged authorizations, the timeline. All of it belongs to a man who spent 20 years being told he'd inherit nothing and decided to simply take it instead. Song, still standing, opened his mouth to object one more time and then visibly reconsidered, sitting down with the expression of a man doing rapid math on how much of this was about to become his problem alone. It didn't take long after that. The judge called a recess that turned into an afternoon, which turned into two officers escorting Deputy Director Song out through a side door he hadn't planned to use, his expensive watch catching the light one last time for the cameras that had shown up to document someone else's downfall entirely. Yoon Tae-sik didn't run when they came for him. He simply sat, very still, in the same seat he'd occupied for the entire hearing, and when Min Jae finally looked at him, really looked at him, for what both men understood would be the last time, Tae-sik didn't offer an explanation. There wasn't one that would have survived contact with the room. 20 years, Min Jae said quietly, not loud enough for the reporters to catch, just for the two of them. I would have given you the company if you'd asked. I didn't want you to give it to me, Tae-sik said. I wanted it to already be mine. There it was, the whole rot in one sentence. Not hunger. Entitlement wearing hunger's clothes. By the time the officers let him out, the same reporters who'd arrived that morning with obituaries half written were sprinting for the doors, phones already lit up, rewriting headlines in real time. Empire collapses became, within the hour, the betrayal behind the boss, and by evening, something quieter, truer, and far more interesting than either. A story about a daughter. Outside the courthouse, the rain had started again. Not the violent, punishing kind from 15 years ago, just an ordinary Seoul afternoon shower, the kind nobody bothers running from. Min Jae came down the steps a free man in every sense the law could measure and found Hana waiting at the bottom briefcase still in hand, hair damp, looking less like the lawyer who just dismantled a conspiracy and more like the girl who used to argue with him over backpacks. Neither of them said anything for a moment. There wasn't a sentence built yet that could hold everything that needed saying, so he just opened his arms. And Hana walked into them exactly the way she had that first night. Except this time, nobody was cold, nobody was starving, and nobody needed rescuing except perhaps each other, the particular way family always ends up needing each other. Long after the emergency that started it, all is past. You didn't have to do that, Min Jae said finally into her hair, echoing words she'd once said to him about a boy and a locker and a restaurant lease that mysteriously vanished. Do what? Hana said, and for the first time in weeks, he heard something in her voice crack open into something like a laugh. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Some debts aren't paid back. They're paid forward, quietly, across 15 years in one courtroom, until nobody can quite remember anymore who rescued whom first. The tabloids called it the greatest legal upset of the decade. The financial channels called it a cautionary tale about internal audits. Neither of them understood the story the way the two people standing in the rain outside that courthouse understood it, that it had never really been about an empire, or a betrayal, or even a trial. It had always just been one simple question, asked in a downpour to a girl who couldn't yet answer it. Have you eaten today? 15 years later, she'd finally given him her answer, not in words, but in the exact, precise, devastating way she'd spent one long night making sure he never went hungry for justice again. And that's the full story. If you believe some debts get paid back tenfold, that loyalty built on love always outlasts loyalty built on greed, and that Yoon Tae-sik got exactly what he deserved. Hit subscribe and drop a comment below. Only the traitors skip that part.